All right. So to get us all started, I am Rachel Pokrzywinski, and I am a 2L at the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm the executive editor of Volume 40 of the Minnesota Journal of Law and Inequality. Also with me is Heather Chang, a fellow 2L and the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Journal of Law and Inequality, Volume 40. Today, we are interviewing Professor Linus Chan about the history of anti-Asian discrimination, racism, and xenophobia in light of the spike in anti-Asian violence associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the recent shooting in Atlanta, where 6 of the victims were women of Asian descent. We are recording this interview for Inequality Inquiry, JLI's online companion publication. And just to provide a brief introduction of our guest, Professor Linus Chan is an associate professor of clinical law and the director of the Detainee Rights Clinic at the law school's Binger Center for New Americans. He's an immigration attorney who focuses on removal defense for those detained by ICE. He also teaches in the area of the intersection of criminal and immigration law. Professor Chan is the recipient of the 2017 University Outstanding Community Service Award for his work at the Binger Center. This award is the highest honor that the university gives for service to the university and community. The National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild named Professor Chan its 2020 member honoree in July. And furthermore, Professor Chan's defense of Cambodian Americans facing deportation earned him Minnesota Lawyer Attorney of the Year honors.
It's all very strange to hear
that. So before we jump in, and Rachel and I are going to kind of rotate asking questions. I think Rachel's going to ask most of them, but thank you so much for joining us and for all of the amazing work that you do. Our first question today is, since the start of the pandemic, reports of anti-Asian violence, hate crimes in the US have spiked 150%. While the rate of violence is greater, the violence itself isn't something that's new. In fact, there's a long history of anti-Asian violence and racism in America. So my question for you is, where and how did that history begin?
Well, that's a loaded question in the sense that, historians, especially Erica Lee, has done a great job of sort of outlining that really a lot of the xenophobia and racism, which I think are very much intertwined, was here from the beginning. When it wasn't, Benjamin, as Erica described, Benjamin Franklin wrote diatribes against the German immigrants. So obviously, it's as soon as people were coming into this country as almost as soon as when there was discrimination or treatment against them. But I think your question is sort of, I would probably take that question to the issue of when specifically violence against Asian immigrants or Asian people in the United States. And that's really, you sort of see that happening during a period of time. Again, usually it spiked right after the Civil War, and it was during this period of time where you had an expansion to the West, and you had a large number of specifically Chinese people coming into the U.S. Now, ironically, the Chinese were invited, right? This was specifically part of a treaty process. This is why you had something called the Burlingame Treaty, which was like a treaty between the United States and China, really trying to regulate immigration. And this is something that the United States wanted. They very much wanted immigrants to come, primarily for the labor shortage, which for much of this country, and continues, I think, in many different sectors, there's been a shortage of laborers, and the Chinese were seen as a source of that. But of course, when economic tides turned, and you had a large number of Chinese and other Asian people in the United States, it also brings rise to the vitriol and racism and violence. You had, specifically the forcible removal of the Chinese, both by state and localities. I think I teach a course on criminal and immigration law, and that's one of the first readings that we had, was how a lot of local, especially one of the most infamous and largest mass lynchings in the United States history was against the Chinese. It was against Chinese minors. And you see it play out in all different sorts of areas. And you see it specifically playing out against women, right? Chinese and Asian women were a particular focal point in a lot of this history. It's one of the readings that also I assigned, which when I read it, was sort of a bit of an aha moment, because I had known a little bit about the history of immigration law has always been sort of directed against prostitution, and specifically Chinese women as prostitution, but reading in the backdrop of the control of what was viewed not just to control specifically as if it was a concern about prostitution, but really a control about Chinese in the United States, because you had a lot of men as laborers who were here, and they were not allowed to marry white Americans. And at the same time, if they came and started to have children, then it became a more large, viable population, right? I just read something about how one of the interesting things about the Scottish and Irish migration to the United States is that they were one of the first immigrant groups that actually brought women during the wave of immigration. And it's one reason why many of those groups were able to outcompete a lot of other immigration groups. Like, their numbers when they came in were similar, but because they were able to bring women, that actually created a more longer lasting community. And so you see the restriction on Chinese women specifically as a way to control what was perceived as a threat, which were Asian immigrants at all. So yeah, I mean, I think it historically it's been around since almost forever, since the very beginning. But I would say right around the start of the 19th through the Reconstruction period was the height of it. That's when you also had the highest aspect of the Know Nothing Party. You had a breakdown of the political parties and issue of immigration, and specifically the Chinese were seen as a specific problem that was something that was really on the minds of a lot of people in the United States. I know it's a long-winded answer. I give those, so I apologize.
It was a good answer, very thorough, thank you. So just to put a name to some of those early practices in immigration, specifically the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, you briefly referenced some of the consequences of those and the causes in your answer. So how has the codification of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian broadly racism in America evolved since those early immigration laws?
Yeah, I have to say it's very interesting. I want to see if I can find it. there is a great book. My office is a mess. And I'm trying to remember the exact title, but this is called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. It's great reading. And one of the reasons why I think it's important is that it separates a little bit about how the United States saw the different Asian, as they called it, Asian races, right? I think it's really interesting because prior to, I think, the Civil Rights Movement, our modern concept of race doesn't really fit into the what and how it was being talked about, right? You did have, especially prior to the 1920s, when there was the eugenics movement that really started to try to group people like Mongoloid and Caucasian and whatnot. But really, a lot of the reference was actually talking about the people, so the Chinese race. So ethnicity and nationality were sort of substituted as race back in this period. And it's what I find interesting is you had this early period where Chinese labor was the issue, and that Chinese laborers were targeted. Now, you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I want to be clear, the Chinese Exclusion Act targeted Chinese laborers. It did not target the merchant class. It did not target what we would consider, of course, a different class of people. But the racial perceptions of the Chinese were driven by the idea that these were uneducated, they were dirty, they were low class, they were diseased, and especially this was true in terms of categorizing Chinese women. Where I find it really interesting, and the One Mighty and Irresistible Tide talked about this, was there was a very different perception of the Japanese. The Japanese were seen as more civilized, more Western in many ways. And in fact, that's why prior to World War II, there was a lot of attempts to foster a stronger relationship. And many of the politicians of that era were talking about how different the Japanese were than the Chinese, right? They were talking about the Japanese as being much more refined and civilized, cultured, and not like the Chinese. And we wanted the Japanese. But of course, that contrasted, went right up against old-fashioned racism. And at the same time, even though you had these politicians who were trying to encourage Japanese immigration, you had the nativists who already were very it was very difficult for them to see the difference, and they objected to the Japanese, and there was in fact a great big diplomacy kerfuffle between the United States and the Japanese, where the Japanese specifically were objected to being treated like they were Chinese, because the idea was, hey, we're not Chinese. Why are you treating us this way? Why are you lumping us in? And this is having to do with what California was doing in terms of not allowing Chinese and Japanese children to go to school in certain other areas. And there was a big diplomacy issue. And in fact, that ended up being something that would end up playing a role later on during World War II, when obviously the Japanese became enemies. And I do want to emphasize this a lot. So you had this period of time, right? You had the early 1800s. There was larger migration of the Chinese and labor. Then you had during the post-World War II period, a lot of pushback and nativism. Then you had the 1920s, which was the rise of eugenics in immigration law, and very much the rise of racism and a view of that. And then, of course, you had World War II. And World War II, I think, played a huge role of shifting the threat, right? Early on, the threat of the Chinese was on morality, was on disease, right? Like they were bringing diseases into our country. They're immoral. Look at what they're, how they are. They are a threat. They're a threat to jobs. They're a threat to workers, right? Because one of the first people that were objecting to the Chinese were laborers. They were miners, railroad workers, and whatnot who viewed the Chinese labor as a problem. Then it became explicitly race. There was an idea of this horde of people challenging the white race, which was very explicitly part of the immigration system and laws in the 1920s. This is when you explicitly, you had the banning of Asian people getting naturalized. You had the challenges to that banning of Asian, of the naturalization. And then you had World War II. And this is, of course, Korematsu. This is the course of where you now not only saw Asian people as threats to morality or to job security or to disease, but now explicitly to national security, right? This is where the justification for Japanese internment, and I don't know, like we didn't really discuss this in class, but like it got so, like, I don't think people know enough about this, and it's written about in a couple places. One in Erica Lee's book, America for Americans, as well as Elliot Young's book, trying to recall, oh, here it is, Forever Prisoners. I should be getting commission. But it talked about a lot how the fear of Asians as a national security threat went beyond our borders. We actually required Peru to start detaining Japanese Peruvians. And these are, like, many of them were Peruvian citizens, or at least Peruvian long-term immigrants, who had no connection to the United States whatsoever. The United States had a policy of not only forcing them to detain them, but ship them over for internment in the United States. So we forcibly removed people living in their homes in Peru, put them on a ship, had them come to the United States, and put them in internment camps in Arizona, alongside other camps that were used for prisoners of war, like German prisoners of war. So this threat, this national security threat, this Asian national security threat, was definitely introduced during this World War II period. And that definitely played a large role. Ironically, I think the political system sort of switched during World War II, where it was the Chinese who were viewed as allies during the World War II effort, while the Japanese were viewed as the enemy, obviously. And then, of course, and you see that going all the way from the post, Reconstruction period. You had very explicitly the Marshall Plan. You had the United States going in. You have the Japanese naval base and what a lot of people from Japan might consider like occupation, while the relationship with China was very different with the nationalist government. And then you had, of course, the threat of communism, right? And once the threat of communism, it also played into this role of Asianness and Asian foreignness as a national security threat. And then, of course, you see the same themes just play themselves in cycles. In the 1980s, the Japanese were seen as potentially threats economically. You had the displaced auto workers, which, of course, tragically led to the death of Vincent Chin. And you see that playing out. And then, unfortunately, we're back in a period of time where it feels a lot like the 1800s again, where we're looking at Asians as a carriers of disease. So, it's this horrible cycle, but you see these themes playing out continuously. It's threats get transformed from national security to disease to morality, and you see that happening. And I think, you know, to a smaller extent, you saw it a little bit with during the Vietnam War, right? You also saw a lot of how those played out, especially during a period of time when we were trying to figure out what to do with the refugees, when we were also viewing specifically Minnesota, people with gang affiliations, and that sort of criminal aspect was also something that became a big role. And now again, of course, I think you hear the political rhetoric again, where you have the United States being very clear about trying to fight against the Chinese and worldwide influence. And so these themes are constantly kind of cycling, ever playing, and they're always there. I think just different periods of time bring out different flavors, so to speak, of why and how Asian people would be considered a threat. Again, very long answer, but. Okay, no, there you go. Okay.
So as you identified, this very much does happen in cycles. What would you say needs to or can be done now to break these cycles?
That feels like a question way above my pay grade. But I will say that here's what I'll say. There are things, I think there have been strategies that immigrant communities themselves have been forced to try to use as a response to these perceptions. I remember very specifically, not too long ago, this is, I think, probably either during George W. or during Obama's tenure, right around the beginning of that period, there was an Asian American serviceman who was in uniform. He was, I believe, in the Air Force and was in uniform, and he had been basically accosted by someone, accusing them of working for the Chinese or for the Asian government. And this officer was like, I'm in a United States service uniform. Like, how much more can I display my patriotism, right? And there is that tendency, and I'll speak more specifically about the Asian American community, where there is a constant feeling where people are having to try to prove their Americanness, right? This is a constant trying to assimilate, trying to kind of make the notion that we love the United States just as much as anybody. And in fact, the Supreme Court case that dealt with a Japanese immigrant who challenged the ban on naturalization, that's exactly what he did in court, is that he went and said, I love the United States. I don't want anything to do with Japan. I love the United States. Here's all the evidence I could show of how much I love the United States. And I think it's a perfect sort of analogy that the court said, yeah, you're great, but you're not the right race. So too bad. And so I think there's a certain point in which I think the Asian American community, for a certain aspect, and I think it's shared by some immigrant communities, but I will say that it might have a unique-ish flavor in the Asian community of like trying to assimilate by trying to prove their Americanness, by trying to do well in all the economic and educational attainment. And I think what we are seeing in the last 20 years or so is looking back and realizing that it doesn't work. That yes, we can have portions of our population, and I want to be clear, it's only portions, right? the Asian American experience, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a rich, diverse, that encompasses everyone from, every sort of walks of life. But it doesn't matter how far we attain in terms of educational and economic when we don't have power and say. And I think right now we are underrepresented when it comes to political representation, when it comes to the idea of political power. I mean, I find we are one of the fastest growing demographics in the United States, and yet we are not given much of any sort of seat at the table when it comes to deciding certain things on a political basis. So I think it's more of a negative prescription than it is a positive one, because I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I do think the idea, or a very large tendency, of staying quiet and making, doing whatever we can to show how we are assimilated or just as good as anybody, it's not working. And I think that's something where we are now. I think if there was a change from Atlanta, which there could be, but if there was, it would be the idea that silence is simply not acceptable anymore, and that it needs to include having a loud voice, right? And not simply allowing our presence and our whatever attainment that we think we can have, whether it's simply being law abiding, or creating Fortune 500 companies, or being medical doctors, is going to be enough to protect us, because I don't think it will.
All right. So my next question revolves more around the law again. So even after facially racist laws are repealed, how has anti-Asian racism persisted in the United States, whether this is through the enforcement of facially neutral laws or outside, independent or not independent from law enforcement action?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the way that race plays any role in society, right? That the lack of explicit language does not mean that the impact is not felt and impacts vulnerable communities, right? I mean, I think that's clear, and I won't belabor that point, except to say that the law, even facially neutral law, is still all subject to the laws of human beings and applied biases and institutions, and that's not going to be any different for Asian or non-Asian. I think that's just the way it is. I do think each community has a slightly different way of experiencing it, and I want to emphasize that I think the Asian community has a slightly different way of having our otherness and loyalty challenged, because so often in the global political dynamic, Asian countries and nations are seen as enemies of the United States, or at least rivals of the United States, if not outright enemies. I think Asian communities, and of course I say this even when technically, for instance, Indonesia and the United States may not have a bad relationship, though, majority Muslim country. It doesn't matter because the perception is always going to tie that into China or to other aspects of it. So I do think one of the ways is just the constant treatment of otherness. And you see this in things like prosecution of Asian American scientists for writing grants, for doing normal scientific community stuff, but because they are Asian American and may be working with Chinese communities, then suddenly they are accused of, there's several different high profile cases on that. And you can see that happening. Where it doesn't, obviously the idea is relatively uncontroversial. You don't want spies, right? But at the same time, how do you determine who's a spy? And are you using, race and national and ethnic origin as one of the factors in doing so? And I think that's a serious question. You're seeing this play out in terms of, unfortunately, of higher education. There's a huge battle about what race and how the battle over affirmative action and what that is being done. And unfortunately, you see this play out. You see this also playing out differently in the Asian American experience because, to be quite frank, I think for a long time, and I think it's still persistent, there is a view that because you have a very visible section of the Asian American community that is doing well economically. And again, not all of Asian Americans are. Many of Asian Americans are in fact, if you look at Minnesota, one of the poorest ethnic groups happens to be Asian. But still, there's that perception. There is a perception of proximity to whiteness, which I think is a challenge in the Asian American community, because we also, the dynamic tends to not focus on the Asian American when we talk about white supremacy or we talk about challenges to vulnerable communities.
So kind of branching off of that, and you talk about vulnerable communities and this white supremacy and dominance, more specifically speaking about the tragic shooting that happened in Atlanta. 6 Asian women were killed, and yet we still see law enforcement now hesitant to classify this as a hate crime. Do you have any thoughts about that, and kind of maybe tied to the history of, denying equal status for Asian Americans?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because interesting is a strange word, but I think it's really illuminating to a certain extent, where you have the debate over hate crime legislation. Usually that debate is brought up more when it's Asian American violence. Vincent Chin and a lot of these things on federal civil rights violations, and when it comes to like hate crime, that debate becomes much more prominent, where of course, and no one would dispute this, Dylan Roof, when he went into a Black church and murdered, Black congregants. And I am not equating them. This is not an equation, but I will say that there was not a debate about hate crimes in that context, right? I think in many ways, I find the conversation very sad, because who cares about whether hate crime legislation would be warranted or not as a societal issue? Like, do each individual people in the public, does the Asian American community know or care whether or not the hate crime statute is involved or not involved? No. Doesn't matter what the guy who did the shooting thinks he was doing it because of, whether it was evangelical purism or was it, views on femicide. No, like all of those things are still implicated regardless of individual motives, right? Because hate crime is always about specific motives of the specific individual. But we don't need that to say that this is a problem. Like that is completely besides the point. I think the debate about whether it should be a hate crime or whether or not the individual specifically knew that he was targeting is one for prosecutors and one for specifically law enforcement. The conversation the rest of us should be having is, well, this is not random. It's not random that he went into massage parlors where Asian women were working and gunned down those people. That's not random, right? And in the context of what's going on, it's clearly not unrelated to what's happening. So having the debate about hate crime or specific motives of the individual is completely beside the point to me. It's very much like, who cares? He doesn't, like, it is, you're not going to see that many people that will explicitly say, or maybe we are now, but it certainly wasn't an expectation a few years ago where we have someone can commit racist acts and declare themselves a racist, right? Even white supremacists now would say, I'm just protecting my people, or some other utter BS, right? Why are we being informed about the debate or question about society based on that narrative or based from that perspective? The perspective that should matter are the people who are perceived as threats, who feel this all the time. And I do think there are other larger, aspects to this. One of the things about the Atlanta shooting that was very, I think, impactful, right? And that was completely glossed over is all the first stories were talking about Asian parlors, and they sort of completely just let the implication lie that these were sex workers. And there was not anything else to it. And then later on, when you have people going, well, there was a 70-something-year-old, there was 50-year-olds, it's like, is this really a sex? And then having the conversation of being unsure of what that implication might mean, if they were sex workers, if they weren't sex workers, what does it mean? What does it mean to have, a lot of these people working in this area, right? There's I actually had a high school classmate of mine who wrote an op-ed about massage industry and Asian American immigrants, right? I mean, I think those are the stories that I'd rather think about and process, because they sort of expose the underlying societal concerns and questions about what it means to be American and means to be Asian in America. I could care less about this guy who decided that this is what he was going to do. Like, I think the tragedy is better explored by, the stories of how this ended up, happening overall, not in a specific incident. Anyway, that's a very long way to answer your question, but I'm running with that theme. So long ways to answer questions.
We appreciate any long answer you want to give us always. But being mindful of your time, we just have one more question. So keeping all of the history that you've kind of detailed for us in mind, what would you say to people who still claim to be surprised by the recent rise in reports of anti-Asian violence in the US?
What would I say? Here's what I would say is, I think very often we take one point of view as if it's the natural default regular person's point of view. And in my own interaction with people, I find that to be the case, where people, and this is not a knock on anybody, this is just natural human behavior, where you take your own experiences and that's where your perspective lies. And it's natural to assume then that perspective is the default natural one. What I will say is, if you are in a minority community, you don't have that luxury. We've never had that luxury. And I'll just say it personally, like when I was born in the United States, but I was actually left and went to kindergarten in Hong Kong, and then I came back as a kid. From the very first day of school, at every single day, and I say this, living in privileged circumstances, I still had to always consider the viewpoint of people who were nothing like me. And I think if all you have to do is, one, just pay attention to what other people who have experienced this, what they're saying. Like I feel it's very strange for me, personally, because, and I don't think this is unusual, I grew up, in the East Coast. I avoided as much as I could being part of an Asian American community. It's just, way I assimilate, right? I just wanted to do that. And then later on in college is when, and the running joke around a lot of Asian American communities is, it's college is when suddenly you want to learn language, suddenly you want to learn your identity. And that's similar to what I experienced. And it has been a very important experience for me to really talk to people who are also Asian Americans, but do not share my experience, for me to even start to kind of understand so much about what's happening. And in a way that's so, I don't know. The best way I could say it is just listen. Like, if there's nothing else, if you're not sure, if you're unsure, if you have any degree of uncertainty, then just listen. You don't have to buy into everything, but if you just listen, then with an open mind, and understand that your perspective is not the only perspective, and the mainstream media perspective is not necessarily providing the one that's being experienced by people on the ground, so to speak, then that should be enough. Yeah, so it sounds cheesy, but that's the best I can come up with.
I think that's fantastic advice. It's simple yet incredibly powerful. And I really want to thank you for your time today and all of the information that you've shared with us. I've certainly learned a lot in a really short time. So I really appreciate it. Rachel, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I would just really like to echo Heather's thanks. It was fantastic to hear from you, and I also learned a lot. So thank you for all of the time and information you shared with us today.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, it's, we could talk forever, right? I mean, this is an ongoing conversation, and I think that's an important thing. And hopefully this talk will lead to something. And I'm generally hopeful and optimistic that it will. So thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation and be willing to listen, and hopefully other people will too. So